On the 5th of July, a mother sent a text message that was 4 words long. What kind of sunglasses?
What kind of sunglasses? 4 words. That was the question Nolan Wells's mother asked in the hours after her son disappeared. Not a question from a prosecutor. Not a question from a reporter. Not a question designed to build a case against anyone. It was a mother trying to give searchers one more detail that might help them recognize her son. The answer, according to private messages now circulating publicly, was simple: Ray-Bans. But that tiny exchange has become part of something much larger, because the person answering Nolan's mother was Warren Hudson, one of the young men who had been with Nolan earlier that day. And those messages reportedly contain something investigators always want in a case like this: a contemporaneous account. What someone was saying while the search was unfolding. What they said they remembered. What they knew. And what they were telling Nolan's mother before the case became a national story. But there is a problem. The internet has already decided what these messages mean. Some people are presenting them as proof that Nolan's friends were telling the truth. Others are presenting them as proof that the friends were hiding something. And neither conclusion can responsibly be reached from a collection of screenshots alone. Because a private message can tell us what someone wrote, it cannot automatically prove that every statement inside it is true. It cannot automatically prove that the conversation is complete. And it cannot automatically tell us what happened hours before the message was sent. So tonight, we are going to do something different. We are going to take the messages and put them back where they belong, inside the timeline. Because if these messages are authentic, their greatest value may not be what they appear to prove. Their value may be whether the story being told in those messages matches the evidence that came before them and the statements that came afterward. And that brings us to a question much more difficult than simply asking, did they lie? What did they say that night? What did they say later? And which parts of the story can actually be independently verified? If you have been following the Nolan Wells investigation and you want fact-based coverage that separates documented evidence from speculation, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Brian Case Records. Because this case has generated thousands of theories. What it needs now is evidence. The messages that have surfaced publicly reportedly begin during the immediate aftermath of Nolan's disappearance. Warren Hudson was communicating with Nolan's mother. Christine Wansley was trying to establish where her son had been, where the group had launched, where the vehicles were, and when anyone had last seen Nolan. These are not strange questions. They are the questions any parent would ask when a child has disappeared. And then Christine asked something more specific. When was the last time you saw him? According to the messages being circulated, Warren answered approximately 3 p.m. When she asked where, the reported answer was the west tip, north side of Horn Island. Then came the question about what Nolan had been wearing. The messages reportedly identify black shorts and sunglasses. And then Christine asked the question that opened this story. What kind of sunglasses? Ray-Bans, according to the reported exchange. At first glance, it sounds like an insignificant detail. But imagine what was happening at that moment. Nolan was missing. Search efforts were beginning. His mother was trying to give people enough information to recognize him. A pair of sunglasses might sound trivial when you are sitting at home watching a documentary. It is not trivial when searchers are looking for your child. And that is what makes the exchange so human. There was no polished public statement yet. No national television coverage. No viral theories. No competing documentaries. No thousands of strangers analyzing every word. There was simply a mother asking someone who had last been with her son what he remembered. And that is why contemporaneous messages can matter. They capture a moment before memory has been reshaped by weeks of interviews, public pressure, and social media discussion. But they still have to be tested. That is the first rule of this investigation. A message is evidence of a communication. It is not automatically proof of the event being described. And that distinction becomes critical when we look at the timeline. According to publicly reported GPS data obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the boat carrying Nolan left the mainland at approximately 9:56 that morning. It reached Horn Island around 11:14 a.m. The day continued. People were on the island. Boats were anchored nearby. Nolan was seen socializing. And according to the accounts that have been publicly attributed to the young men who were with him, Nolan was fine during the afternoon. Then, around 3 p.m., the timeline reaches its first major anchor. Warren Hudson has said he last saw Nolan at approximately that time. The messages now circulating reportedly contain the same general time. That consistency is worth noting. But it does not solve the case, because 3 p.m. is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the most important unanswered window. What happened after Nolan was last seen? The friends have said Nolan remained on the island. Their account is that Nolan had been with a young woman and chose to stay behind rather than return on the boat. That explanation has been publicly disputed by Nolan's family. Nolan's father, Elmore Wansley, said he did not believe his son would voluntarily remain behind when his friends left. He described Nolan as someone who normally stayed with his group. That is a family's understanding of Nolan. It is not independent proof of what happened. And the friend's account is also not automatically proof of what happened. The investigation has to determine which version is supported by evidence. That is why the next part of the timeline matters so much. Because the boat itself was having trouble. A call was made to Sea Tow from the area of Horn Island. The caller reported that the boat's bilge pump had stopped working and that the vessel was taking on water. The caller asked for help. And when asked whether everyone was on the boat and okay, the caller said everyone was on board and okay. That statement has received enormous attention because Nolan was later reported to have remained on the island. But there is an important distinction here. The caller's statement is evidence of what the caller said during that call. It is not, by itself, proof of who was physically on the boat at every moment before or after the call. And that is precisely why the audio has to be examined in context. The public record establishes that the boat had a problem. The public record establishes that a Sea Tow call occurred. The public record establishes that the boat later left Horn Island. And the GPS data places the departure at approximately 4:31 p.m. Those pieces fit together. But they do not answer every question. They tell us the boat was leaving. They do not tell us everything happening on the island at the same time. They do not tell us what Nolan was doing at the exact moment the boat departed. And they do not establish what happened to him afterward. That is where the case becomes difficult. Because the friends have said Nolan chose to remain behind. They have said he expected to get back to the mainland another way. And they have maintained that they did not simply abandon him. Nolan's family has questioned that account. The woman Nolan was reportedly with has also been discussed publicly, and accounts about the nature and duration of their interaction have varied. Again, that does not automatically mean someone lied. People can interpret the same interaction differently. One person may describe spending time together. Another may describe the encounter as brief. One person may remember a conversation. Another may not consider the same conversation important enough to remember. Investigators have to determine which details can be corroborated. And that is why the leaked messages become interesting. Because if Warren was communicating directly with Nolan's mother while the search was beginning, investigators can compare those statements with later accounts. That comparison is more useful than the messages being treated as a standalone verdict. Suppose the same detail appears in the messages and later interviews. That consistency matters. Suppose another detail changes. That also matters. But even then, a difference does not automatically prove deception. People can remember differently. They can misunderstand a question. They can become confused about time. They can learn new information. or they can intentionally misrepresent something. Only additional evidence can help distinguish between those possibilities. And that is exactly why the title question needs a question mark. They lied about everything, not they lied about everything. Because we do not have evidence establishing that conclusion. What we have are competing accounts, and the job of an investigation is to test them. Now consider what happened to Nolan's phone. This is where the story becomes even more complicated. Nolan disappeared, but his phone did not. His phone returned to the mainland. His family eventually obtained it, and the device became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Why? Because Nolan was a young person who used his phone regularly. His parents expected it to contain digital traces of his life. Messages, photographs, applications, location information, social media activity, and potentially information about the hours before his disappearance. Nolan's mother has publicly said that when she looked at the phone, she did not find the Snapchat material she expected to see from that day. That became one of the family's central concerns. But the young men associated with the trip have denied deleting information from Nolan's phone. There has been no public finding establishing that one of them deleted evidence from the device. That means we cannot responsibly turn the missing material into a proven act of tampering. Instead, we have a question. What happened to the data? Was it never saved? Did it disappear naturally through the application's design? Was it deleted? Was it stored somewhere else? Can it be recovered? Or was the family's expectation about what should have been on the phone simply different from what the device actually retained? Those questions require forensic analysis, not a social media argument, not a reaction video, forensic analysis. And that is why the phone matters so much, because the phone does not have to choose sides. It can be examined. Data can be extracted. Metadata can sometimes be analyzed. Deleted material can sometimes be recovered. External accounts can sometimes contain information that no longer appears on the physical device. And investigators can compare digital records against witness statements. That is potentially far more powerful than a screenshot circulating online. But the phone has become caught in a dispute over how and when it should be examined. The family has said the device was made available for forensic examination. Attorneys representing people connected to the trip have publicly disputed aspects of the family's cooperation and access to the phone. The parties have also discussed procedures governing how the device would be handled, who would conduct the examination, how extracted data would be preserved, and who would have access to it. Those disagreements have created another layer of uncertainty. But we need to be careful with the word withheld. A dispute over forensic protocol is not automatically the same thing as refusing to surrender evidence. Likewise, saying the phone is available is not the same thing as saying the examination has already produced answers. The important fact is that the device has been central to a dispute between the parties, and that dispute has continued while the public waits for clarity. Now step back for a moment. Think about what we have. A last reported sighting around 3 p.m., a boat experiencing mechanical trouble, a distress call, a GPS-recorded departure around 4:31, Nolan not returning with the group, a phone returning to the mainland, a missing person report later that night, a search, and Nolan's body found in the water 2 days later. That is the skeleton of the timeline. But a skeleton is not the entire body. There are still details that have to be filled in. And that is where another piece of evidence entered the public conversation. A video. The recording became controversial because a voice in it was initially interpreted as Nolan's. The voice appeared to involve someone demanding a phone. That interpretation spread rapidly. People began discussing the recording as though it captured Nolan during his final hours. But then Trayston Shepard came forward and said the voice was his. He described an altercation involving himself and another person. He said Nolan was not the person speaking in the recording. That does not answer the broader mystery of Nolan's death, but it teaches us something essential about this case. A real recording can still be misunderstood. The video can be genuine. The voice can be genuine. The argument can be genuine. And the identity of the person speaking can still be incorrectly assigned. That is exactly what makes the leaked texts so important to handle carefully. The question is not whether the internet can create an interpretation. The question is whether the interpretation survives verification. And Nolan's case has already shown how quickly unverified interpretations can spread. At one point, an alleged toxicology document circulated online. People quoted numbers from it. People debated what those numbers supposedly meant. But authorities indicated the document was fraudulent. The official toxicology findings were not publicly released to support the claims being made online. So the document could not responsibly be used to establish what Nolan had consumed or whether substances played a role in his death. Then there were artificial intelligence-generated videos involving Nolan and his family. Videos that could make people believe they were watching real footage when they were actually looking at synthetic material. This is not just a problem for Nolan's case. It is a problem for modern investigations. Because the amount of information online can create the illusion that investigators have more evidence than they actually do. 100 videos can repeat the same claim. 1,000 comments can repeat the same accusation. 1,000,000 views can make a theory feel established. None of that turns a theory into evidence. And that is why this case has to be rebuilt from the ground up. Start with the records. Start with the GPS. Start with the audio. Start with the timestamps. Start with the phone. Start with the autopsy. Then compare the statements. Not the other way around. Because if you start with the conclusion, every piece of evidence will be interpreted to support it. If you start with the evidence, the conclusion may be very different. And that brings us back to July 4th. The GPS data is one of the strongest objective pieces of information publicly available. It shows the boat leaving the mainland at approximately 9:56 in the morning. It reaches Horn Island around 11:14. It remains in the area for hours. Then the boat leaves around 4:31 in the afternoon. Afterward, the GPS data tracks the vessel back toward the mainland. It reaches the original area around 5:44 p.m. Later records show movement toward Fort Bayou and additional travel that evening. That means the boat's movements after the island are not simply a matter of someone's memory. There is a recorded digital trail, and that trail can be compared against statements. It can help establish whether the basic sequence is accurate. But it still cannot tell us everything. GPS tells us where the vessel was. It does not tell us every person who was standing on it. It does not record every conversation. It does not tell us what happened on shore. And it cannot tell us what Nolan did after the boat left. That is why the last confirmed sighting remains so important. Around 3 p.m. Then the boat trouble develops. Then the sea tow call. Then the departure. And somewhere inside that period is the point at which Nolan's circumstances changed forever. The friend's account is that Nolan stayed. They say he had been with a young woman. They say they asked him to return. They say he chose not to. They say the boat's emergency forced them to leave. And they say they believed he could return to the mainland on another boat. Nolan's family has questioned that explanation. And the public has questioned it too. But the fact that a story is difficult to understand does not automatically make it false. That is another lesson this case keeps forcing us to confront. Sometimes people make decisions that seem irrational after something terrible happens. Sometimes people remember events differently. Sometimes an explanation sounds strange because we are hearing it without the context the people involved had at the time. And sometimes a strange explanation really does contain a contradiction. The only way to know which is to investigate. Now look at the messages again. Christine asks where the vehicles are. She asks where the boats launched. She asks when Nolan was last seen. She asks what he was wearing. She asks about the sunglasses. These are not the messages of a mother who already knows what happened. They are the messages of someone trying to reconstruct her son's movements. And Warren's reported responses matter because he was one of the people with Nolan. But notice something important. The messages do not tell us what happened after the last sighting. They do not provide a complete account of the critical afternoon. They do not establish Nolan's cause of death. They do not establish whether someone harmed him. And they do not establish that anyone deliberately concealed information. They provide a snapshot that may be useful, but still only a snapshot. And that is why the phrase, leaked texts reveal everything, would be misleading. They don't reveal everything. They may reveal something. The challenge is determining exactly what. And that is the kind of question investigators are trained to answer. What time was this message sent? Who had the phone? Who had access to the conversation? Was the conversation preserved in its entirety? Can the metadata be verified? Do the statements match known records? Do they match the GPS? Do they match the CTO call? Do they match witness interviews? Do they match the later statements given publicly? And if they don't match, why? Those questions are more powerful than any accusation, because evidence can withstand scrutiny. A theory cannot. And there is another reason the timeline matters. Nolan's body was not found immediately. The search continued into July 6. A National Park Service ranger eventually found him in the water near Horn Island. Dental records were used to confirm his identity. The discovery ended the search for Nolan as a missing person, but it began a different investigation. How did he die? The state conducted an autopsy. The findings have not been publicly released. The family then obtained an independent autopsy. That examination did not provide a definitive cause or manner of death. The family was told the cause was undetermined and the manner was undetermined, pending further investigation. That is not a declaration of homicide. It is not a declaration of accident. It is uncertainty. And uncertainty is difficult for a family to live with, especially when the internet is offering hundreds of different answers. Some people have insisted that Nolan was murdered. Others have insisted that the death was accidental. Others have argued that the friends are being unfairly blamed. Others have argued that authorities have not done enough. But the publicly documented evidence does not allow us to confidently make any of those final conclusions. The official investigation remains active. Jackson County authorities have said they are continuing to gather information. The district attorney has indicated that investigators must follow the evidence and that information cannot always be released publicly during an active investigation. A grand jury review is expected when the investigation is complete. That means the absence of a public conclusion is not itself proof of a cover-up. It may simply mean the investigation has not reached the point where prosecutors can publicly establish a case. At the same time, the family's demand for answers is legitimate. They have every reason to want the investigation pursued thoroughly, and they have sought additional support. Ben Crump became involved. The Congressional Black Caucus called for federal review. And on August 17th, the Knox announced that its Office of General Counsel had joined the family's legal team. That escalation is significant, but it must be described accurately. The Knox's involvement does not establish that someone murdered Nolan. It does not establish that local investigators acted improperly. It does not establish that the 3 young men connected to the trip committed a crime. It means a major civil rights organization has joined the family's legal effort, seeking answers and greater scrutiny. That is an important development, but it is not a verdict. And this distinction is especially important because the public argument surrounding Nolan's death has become increasingly hostile. Threats have been made against people connected to the case. Several people have faced criminal charges in connection with alleged threats. That is another part of the story that should not be confused with evidence about Nolan's death. A person threatening a witness or official does not prove the underlying theory about Nolan. It proves only that a separate alleged crime occurred. And yet the online environment has repeatedly blurred those boundaries. One person's accusation becomes another person's evidence. One person's theory becomes another person's fact. And eventually, people who were never on Horn Island begin speaking with more certainty than the people who were actually there. That is where responsible reporting has to stop the cycle. We can ask questions. We can investigate contradictions. We can examine documents. We can follow new evidence. But we cannot manufacture certainty. Now there is another development that could become important. The Wells family's legal team has pursued additional records related to the Marine response. Subpoenas have reportedly sought communications and other records connected to Sea-Tow and Ward Marine Services around the time of Nolan's disappearance. Why does that matter? Because contemporaneous records can sometimes resolve disputes that human memory cannot. If a call was made, there may be a record. If a dispatcher received information, there may be a timestamp. If a vessel was sent somewhere, there may be a log. If a communication occurred, there may be a recording. And if the records contradict a later recollection, investigators have something concrete to examine. This is the direction the case needs to move, away from viral certainty, toward documentary evidence. Because the central question is no longer simply, who should we believe? It is, what can be independently established? That is a much harder question. But it is the right one. And it brings us back to the alleged text messages. If the messages are authentic, they could help establish what Warren was saying to Nolan's mother during the search.
Authorities had to publicly
That could
denounce
matter.
it. That is
If the
not the
messages are
only thing that was
incomplete,
manufactured.
investigators need to know
Videos of
that.
Nolan Wells have appeared
If the
online
messages have been
that were
selectively
generated
presented,
by artificial
that
intelligence.
matters too.
Videos of his family,
If the statements
a boy
inside
who
them are
died in
consistent
July,
with other
made
evidence,
to move and
that
speak on a
consistency
screen by
matters.
strangers who never
If
met
they
him,
conflict with other
distributed to an
evidence,
audience
the
that could
conflict
not always
matters.
tell.
But
Then
the
it stopped
messages
being
should not be
content.
turned into a conclusion
3 people have
before
now
that
been
comparison
federally
is
charged
complete.
in 3 separate
Because
cases
the most interesting
over
thing
threats
about these
connected to this
texts may not be the
investigation.
fact that Warren
Edward
was
James
communicating
Porter
with
from
Nolan's
Illinois
mother.
is
The most
accused of
interesting
sending
thing may
threatening
be what
messages through
happens when those
Facebook to the
communications
mother
are
of
compared
Warren
with the
Hudson.
later record.
Investigators
And that
say
is
one
where
of
the
those
case gets
messages
much harder.
contained photographs of her
Because
children.
Warren has publicly
Michelle
described
Francine
Nolan
Edwards
as having
from
chosen to
Cincinnati,
stay
Ohio,
behind.
is accused of
He has
phoning in
described the
bomb
boat
threats to 2
emergency.
Mississippi
He
government
has described
offices in the
trying to
days
get
after
Nolan back
Nolan's
on the
death.
boat.
Joseph
He has
Alfredo
described Nolan
Vasquez
saying he would
Dumarce
return
from
another way.
California is accused of
Those
threatening a
are
chancery
significant
court
claims.
judge. Illinois,
But they are
Ohio,
still claims that need to be
California.
compared with
None
the
of them
available
appears to have
evidence.
any connection to
The
Nolan
Sea-Tow
Wells.
call provides one
None of them
independent
knew his
point.
family.
The
None of them was
GPS
anywhere
provides
near
another.
that island.
The
They
messages
watched this
provide
case on
another.
their phones
The
from
statements
3
from
different
other
corners of the
witnesses
country
provide another.
and decided
The
they
phone
had
provides
standing to
another.
threaten people
The
in
medical
Mississippi.
evidence provides
The
another.
Hudson family
And the
gave
more
recordings of
independent
some of the
points that
calls
line
they
up,
received
the
to the
stronger
Sun
the
Herald.
reconstruction becomes.
One caller says,
If they do
"Justice
not
for
line
Nolan
up,
Wells,
investigators
son
have
for
to
a
ask
son."
why.
Another calls
That is how an
Benjamin Hudson,
investigation
the
should
father of a
work.
murderer.
Not
No
by
one in
choosing
that
a
family
favorite
has been
side,
charged with anything.
by testing every
Sheriff
side.
John Ledbetter had
And
to
that is
issue
why
a
I
public
don't want to
statement
tell you that
asking
these
people to
messages
stop
prove
spreading
Warren
unverified information about
They
a death
don't.
investigation.
I also don't want to
Now
tell you
here
that
is
these
how
messages
fast a
prove
claim
Warren
moves
told
in
the
this
complete
case.
truth.
Documented.
They don't.
From beginning to
What
end.
they do
in
is
72
give us another
hours.
piece of the
On the
timeline.
10th of July,
And the timeline
Ben
is
Crump
where
held
this
a
case
press
should be
conference
examined.
and referenced a video taken
Because
from
there
a
is a
boat near
difference
the
between
island.
suspicion
On
and
that recording,
contradiction.
a young man's voice
Suspicion
can be
says
heard
something
demanding his
feels
phone
wrong.
back. Crump
Contradiction
said his
says
legal
two
team
pieces
believed
of
that voice
evidence
belonged to
cannot
Nolan
both
Wells.
describe the same
Within
event
hours, it was
accurately.
everywhere.
And
The phone
contradiction
argument,
is where
the
investigators
confrontation,
have something they can
Nolan's
actually
last words.
test.
On the 13th
If one
of July,
record says one
a young
thing
man
happened
named
at 3
Trayston
p.m.
Shepard
and another
went to
independent
ABC
record
News
establishes
and said the
something
voice
different,
on that recording
that
was his
discrepancy
own.
matters.
He described standing
person
waist deep
says
in
they
the
saw
water having
someone
a
at a certain
disagreement with his
location
girlfriend,
and a
being
reliable digital
criticized by an
record places
acquaintance
them
who walked
somewhere else,
past, and
that
that
matters.
exchange escalating into
If
a
someone
physical
says a phone was
altercation.
never
He
accessed
said
and
Nolan
forensic
was not the
analysis
one
shows
shouting.
otherwise,
3
that
days.
matters. But until
That is the
those
gap
things are
between a claim
established, they
entering the
remain
world
questions.
and the person in
And
the recording
questions are not
correcting it.
accusations.
The claim is still
That is the
circulating.
line this channel
the
needs to
correction is not.
maintain.
And every
Because
unverified
Nolan's family
fragment
deserves
since has
answers.
followed the same path.
But Nolan's
because
friends
the
also
space it
deserve the
travels
presumption
through
that
was never
allegations
filled by
against
anyone
them
with
must be
actual
supported
authority.
before being
Which
presented
brings
as
us to the
fact.
one thing
Those
capable of
principles
ending
are not
all of
contradictory.
it, and the reason it has not
They
been
are the
opened.
foundation of
In
responsible
the middle of
reporting.
July, both
And
sides
perhaps that
agreed
is
to
what
a
has been
joint
missing from
forensic
the
examination
conversation
of Nolan's
surrounding this
phone.
case.
Read that again.
Not information.
Agreed.
There is
The
plenty
family
of
wanted
information.
it. The district
What is
attorney's
missing
office
is
wanted it.
hierarchy.
The attorney
Which
representing the
information is
young men from the
verified?
boat wanted it.
Which
There is no
information is
faction in this
disputed?
case arguing
Which
that the phone
information
should
comes
stay
directly
closed.
from an
It is
official
the
record?
21st of August.
Which
It has
information
not been
comes from a
examined.
witness?
And in the last 2
Which
weeks,
information
the two
comes from
lawyers
an
at the
attorney?
center of that failure
Which
have made
information comes
statements
from a
that
social
cannot
media
both be
account?
true.
And which
Tyler Cox
information has no
represents three
reliable
of
source
Nolan's
at all?
friends. Speaking
Once
to
you
Dan
separate
Abrams
those
on
categories,
SiriusXM,
the story
Cox
changes.
said he has reason to
The
believe
internet
and
becomes
does
quieter.
believe that the Wells
dramatic
family has not
claims become
cooperated with
fewer.
law enforcement.
But
He
the
said he does
genuine
not think they
unanswered
have turned in
questions
Nolan's
become
phone.
much clearer.
The attorney for the
We know
young men
Nolan was on
publicly
Horn
accusing
Island.
the dead boy's
We know the
family
boat
of
arrived.
withholding evidence.
We know the
Ahmad
boat later
Smith
left.
represents the Wells
We know
family.
there was a mechanical
On the 17th of August,
We
he
know a
wrote
distress
directly
call
to
was
Jackson
made.
County District
We know the
Attorney
boat's
Angel
movements were
Myers
recorded.
McElrath.
We know Nolan
His letter
did not
states
return
that to
with
the
that
extent
boat.
there has been any
We know he was
suggestion the
reported
family has
missing
been
later that
unwilling
night.
or has failed to
We know his
cooperate
body
with the
was found 2
investigation,
days later.
that is not the case.
We know the family
it says
commissioned
the family
an
and their
independent
legal team
autopsy.
are actively
We
conducting
know that
an
examination
independent
did not
investigation
determine a
and remain
definitive cause
cooperative
or
with her
manner
office.
of death.
It states
We know
that
the official
Nolan's phone has been
investigation
made
remains
available for
ongoing.
examination by
And we know the
forensic
family
experts from
continues
both
to
sides.
seek answers.
Then it addresses the delay
Those are the
directly.
foundations.
According to the family's
Now come the
attorneys,
questions.
Nolan's
What
parents were
happened
out of
between
state
the
at the
last
time of the
confirmed
scheduled
sighting
examination.
and the boat's departure?
And the parties had
What
not
exactly did
finalized a
Nolan
forensic
say when his
protocol,
friends told him
meaning
they
the
were
written
leaving?
rules governing
Was
how
he
the device
expecting
would
another
actually be
ride?
handled. Chain of
Who,
custody,
if anyone,
preservation of the
spoke with him
extracted
after the
data,
boat left?
who gets access
Did
to what
anyone
comes
see
off
him
it,
after the
and
group
when the
departed?
phone is returned to the family.
What did his phone record?
Smith closes by
What
asking
data
the district
remains
attorney to
recoverable?
confirm whether the
What information
examination will
exists
still
on
take
external
place at the
platforms?
location both sides had
What do the
previously
marine
selected,
records show?
a community college.
And what does the complete
That is a
forensic
man
record
asking a
eventually
prosecutor to
establish?
confirm a room.
Those questions are
Two
more
named
important than the
attorneys,
loudest
two
theory on
positions on the
social
public
media.
record.
Because
One
the
says the
truth does
phone
not
was never
become more
handed
true.
over.
Because more
One
people
says the
repeat
phone
it.
has been available the
It becomes
entire
stronger
time,
when
and the sticking
independent
point
evidence
is the
supports it.
paperwork governing how
That
it
is
gets
the standard
opened.
Nolan
They
Wells
cannot
case
both
deserves.
be accurate.
And
This
it is the
channel is
standard
not
we
going
are
to
going
tell
to
you which
follow.
one is lying,
There is
because
one
we
more
do
thing
not
about
know,
those messages
and anyone
that
claiming
deserves
otherwise
attention.
is guessing at you with
The
confidence.
emotional tone.
What we can tell
Warren
you is
was
what sits
communicating
between
with
those
Nolan's
two letters.
mother after the
48
disappearance.
days.
According
One
to the
device,
messages circulating
two Snapchat
publicly,
accounts that a
he
mother
was
says
answering
were
her
empty when
questions.
she opened them,
He was
and a set of
providing
friends who say
information.
nothing was
He
ever
was
deleted.
telling her what he remembered.
A question with a factual
He was
answer,
involved in the immediate
recoverable in an
communication
afternoon by a
surrounding the
competent
search.
examiner
Some
that
people
has
see
now
that as
outlived the
evidence
news
of
cycle,
innocence.
the trending
Others
hashtag,
see it as
and the
something a
boy's
guilty
19th
person
birthday.
could also do.
And there is one
Neither
more document in
conclusion
this
is
case that
scientifically
nobody
useful.
is permitted to read.
Behavior after
On
a
the 22nd
disappearance
of July,
is not a
at the
substitute
NOP
for
National
evidence about
Convention
what
in
happened
Chicago,
before the
Ben
disappearance.
Crump stood beside
A
Elmore
person
and
can
Christine
cooperate
Wansley
and still have
announced the
information
findings of
that
the
needs
autopsy their
investigation.
family had paid for.
A person can
Cause of
refuse
death,
to cooperate
undetermined.
and still be
Manner
innocent.
of death,
A
undetermined.
person's
Pending
emotional response
investigation.
does not establish
That is
the
the
cause
answer
of
a
another
family
person's
receives
death.
when the medical
That
evidence
is why
cannot close the
investigators
question.
focus on facts
It does not
that
say
can be
accident.
corroborated.
It does not say
And
drowning.
that is why the
It does
messages
not
should
say
be treated as
homicide.
a source of
It rules out
information
nothing,
rather
which
than a
means it leaves
psychological
every
test.
possibility standing in the
We should
room at
not
once,
ask, does
including
this
the
sound
ones
like
no
an innocent
parent wants
person?
standing there.
We should ask,
But the report
does
carried
this
something
statement
else.
match the
Limitations.
evidence? That
The
is a
examiner
completely
noted the
different
constraints
question,
he had been working
and
under.
it is much harder
According
to
to
manipulate.
TMZ, when
Now
Nolan's
think
body
about the
was released for
sunglasses
that
question
second
again.
examination,
What
it
kind of
arrived without his
sunglasses?
throat,
It
without
is
his
such a
lungs,
small detail.
and without without the
But
original
that small
autopsy
question
photographs.
captures the entire
Organs are
tragedy of this
retained
case.
during a state
A
autopsy.
mother was no
That
longer
happens.
asking her son
There are
what he was doing.
protocols, and retention
She was
alone is
asking
not
other people
evidence
to
of
help
anything
identify
improper.
him.
But
She was
consider
trying
what
to
those two
reconstruct his
specific
last known
organs mean
movements.
in a death
She
where
was
the
looking
central
for
question
details,
is whether an
and every detail
18-year-old
mattered.
drowned.
That is
The
what
lungs are where a
investigators were
drowning
doing
is
too.
proven or disproven.
Except
The throat
investigators
is
have
where
to
you
go
look for
further.
anything else.
They cannot
the
stop at what
pathologist
someone
hired to
remembers.
determine how Nolan
They have
Wells
to
died
determine what the
was
evidence
asked to
can
do it without
establish.
the two structures
And
that answer the
sometimes that
question.
means following
He
a
returned
phone.
undetermined.
Sometimes
had
it means
no other
following a
option
boat.
available to him.
Sometimes
Now
it
the
means
second
following
report.
a call.
The state of Mississippi has
Sometimes it
completed
means
its
following
autopsy.
a timestamp.
The gross
And
findings, the
sometimes it means going
toxicology,
back to a
the
four-word
histology,
question asked
the
in the
full
middle of the
document.
night.
It exists.
What kind of
It has
sunglasses?
existed for weeks.
Because
It
those
is
four
sealed.
words were part
Nobody
of a
outside a
conversation
small
taking
circle
place
has
while
read a
Nolan's
line of
mother
it,
was trying
and
to
nobody
find
will
him.
until a
And now,
grand jury
weeks
reviews
later,
the case.
that conversation
On the
is being
18th of
examined
August,
by millions
District
of people
Attorney
who
Angel
were nowhere
Myers
near the
McElrath
island.
explained why,
The challenge
and her
is to make
statement
sure
is
the
worth
public does not
understanding rather
confuse the
than
conversation
resenting.
with the
She
conclusion.
said she understands
The
the
messages
public's
are not the
urgency
end of the
to know
investigation.
what happened to Nolan,
They are one
but
more
that they are
piece.
not taking time
And
for
perhaps their
time's
greatest
sake.
value is that they
That
can be
every piece
compared
of
with
evidence
everything
must
else.
be examined, every
The
credible lead
GPS,
followed to its
the
conclusion,
CETO call,
every witness
the phone,
interview analyzed
the
in the
witness
context
accounts,
of all other
the
evidence.
later interviews,
that the pressure
the
for
forensic
answers does not
findings,
change what the work
and the official
requires.
investigation.
Then she addressed the silence
If
directly.
those pieces eventually
In
point in the
Mississippi,
same direction,
the rules of
the
professional
story
conduct
becomes
restrict
clearer.
what a prosecutor
If
may
they
release
contradict
during an
each other,
investigation.
investigators
She said
have
the
more work
restraint
to
is
do.
not an effort to keep
Either
the truth
way,
from the public,
the evidence
but to
should
protect
lead,
the integrity of the
not the
investigation
headline,
and the
not the
grand jury
hashtag,
proceeding. And she
not the
committed to
theory,
presenting that
the
grand jury
evidence.
with the complete
And
evidence,
that is where the
a
first
thorough
part of this investigation
and an
leaves us.
understanding of the law.
Not with a
So
proven
hold the shape of
accusation,
this.
not
The
with
one
a
person
proven
in the state
cover-up,
of Mississippi
not
holding
with
the
proof
document
that
that could
Nolan's
end the
friends lied
speculation
about
is
everything,
legally forbidden from
and
showing
not
it
with
to
proof
anyone.
that every account
Her
given by
silence
those
is not
friends is
obstruction.
correct.
It is the rule,
We are left with
which
something
means
more
that for
uncomfortable.
7 weeks, the
An
entire public
unresolved
understanding
timeline,
of how this
a
boy
disputed
died has
explanation
been built
for why
out of
Nolan
leaked
remained
text
behind.
messages, television
A phone
panels,
that has become
a
central
forged
to the
toxicology
family's
report,
questions,
and videos
a
generated by
collection
machines.
of messages whose contents
Every
are being
single one of
debated
them
publicly,
filling a vacuum that
a
the only
recorded
credible
distress
source
call,
is prohibited from
GPS
filling
data
herself.
documenting
That
the
is
boat's
why the
movements,
phone matters more than
an
any
independent
of it. It is the
autopsy
one
that did
piece of
not
evidence in
establish a
this case
definitive
that is not
cause or
sealed,
manner of death,
not fraudulent,
and an
not
official
anonymous,
investigation
and not
that remains
contested
open.
as to its existence.
The next question
Both
is not
sides
whether
agree
the
it is
internet
real.
has already chosen its
Both
answer.
sides agree
The
it
next
could be
question
open tomorrow.
is whether
And
the evidence
48
will
days
eventually
after
force
Nolan Wells
everyone
died,
to change
it
theirs.
is still the only door in this
Because
case
if those
that
messages
anybody
are
actually
authentic,
has the key
they give
to.
us a rare look into
Everything
the
you have
hours
heard about this
immediately
case
after Nolan
falls
disappeared.
into one of 4 categories.
And if their contents
Most
can be
channels will not
independently
separate them
verified,
for you.
they may help
We will.
investigators
Confirmed.
determine which parts of the
Nolan Wells
timeline were
traveled to
consistent
Horn
from the
Island on the
beginning
4th of July.
and which parts
The
changed
Jackson
later.
County Sheriff's
But
Office
there is
states
another
he was
side
last
to that.
seen near the
If the
island at
messages are
around 3 in the
incomplete,
afternoon.
then we need to know what
Marine
is missing.
Resources
If
GPS
they have been
data,
selectively
obtained by
presented,
CBS
that
News,
matters.
records the boat
If a
departing at
statement appears to
approximately
conflict with a
4:31.
verified record,
His body was
that
recovered on the
matters.
6th of July.
And if everything
His family
ultimately
retrieved
lines
his
up,
phone from a
that
friend's
matters
house on the
too.
evening of the 4th.
That is what
The
evidence
independent
does.
autopsy
It does
returned
not care
undetermined
which side
on
we
both
wanted to be
cause
right.
and manner.
It does
The
not
state
care which
autopsy is
theory
complete
generated the
and
most
sealed
views.
pending grand jury
It does
review.
not care which
A
person
joint
received
forensic
the most
examination was
criticism.
agreed
It
and has
simply
not taken
narrows
place.
the possibilities.
The Knopp's Office of
And
General
Nolan
Counsel
Wells's
joined the
family
family's legal
deserves
team on the
exactly
17th
that,
of August.
a narrowing
The
of
Congressional Black
possibilities.
Caucus has requested
A
a Department of
reconstruction of
Justice
the
review.
timeline.
3 people have
An
been federally
explanation for
charged
the
over
unanswered
threats connected to
questions.
this case.
And
The
eventually,
toxicology
if the
report
evidence allows
circulating
it,
online
an
is
answer
fraudulent.
to the question that has
Claimed
remained
by
at the
named
center of this
parties
tragedy
and
since
disputed.
July 4.
That data was
What happened
deleted
to
from
Nolan
Nolan's
Wells?
phone. His
For
mother
now,
says it was.
we do not have
His
a
friends
publicly
say it was
established
not.
answer.
That the
And
family has
anyone who
failed to
tells you
cooperate.
otherwise is giving
Tyler
you
Cox
certainty
says
that
so.
the evidence has
Ahmad
not
Smith
yet
says the
earned.
opposite in writing
That
to the
is why the
district
leaked
attorney.
messages
That the
should not
vessel
be
was
ignored.
misidentified in
But
the
they should
official
not be
report.
worshipped either.
Asserted on a television
them.
panel.
Question
Never
them.
confirmed by any authority.
Compare them.
Each of those has a
Verify
name
them.
attached to it.
And then
Not
look
one
beyond
has been
them.
resolved.
Because the
Unverified.
truth, if it is found,
Everything else,
will not
the
exist
additional
inside
witnesses,
one screenshot.
the additional people
It will
supposedly on
exist
that
in the
island,
connections
the
between
screenshots,
independent
the
pieces of
accounts claiming
evidence,
inside sources,
the timestamp
the
that
little
matches
birdies.
the GPS,
This channel is
the call
not going
that
to
matches
repeat
the
those
boat's
claims.
movement,
Not this
the
week,
statement that
not
matches
next
the
week,
phone record,
not until a named
the
source
forensic
with something
finding
to
that
lose
matches
puts
the
their name
timeline.
on them.
That
3
is how an
people are facing
investigation
federal
becomes a
charges
case.
because that material
And
found
that is
an
how a
audience
mystery
willing to
becomes
act
an
on it.
answer.
We will not
The
be part
story
of the
of
supply
Nolan
chain,
Wells is
not
still being
established.
written.
Whether
But the
any
most
person
responsible
committed any
thing we can
offense in
do is
connection with the
refuse
death
to
of
write the
Nolan
ending
Wells,
before the evidence
nobody has
does.
been charged,
So
nobody has
remember the
been
four
named as a
words that
suspect by
started this
any authority.
investigation.
No cause of death has
kind
been
of
publicly
sunglasses?
determined by the state.
A mother asking
Hold
for one
all
more
four of
detail,
those categories at
one more
once,
clue,
and you are holding
one
this
more way
case
to help
honestly.
searchers find her
Collapse
son.
them into one,
The answer
and
may
you
have been
become the
simple.
reason a sheriff
The
had to
case is
ask the
not.
public to stop.
Because
Strip
behind
away the
those 4
lawyers,
words
the letters,
is a
the
timeline
panels,
that still has
the forged
unanswered
documents
gaps.
and the generated
Behind that
videos and the
timeline is a phone
voicemails
that has
left on a
generated
family's
enormous
answering
controversy.
machine by
Behind the
strangers in
phone
3
are
states.
competing accounts.
What is underneath all of
Behind
it
those
is a
accounts are
boy,
records that can be
18
tested.
years old.
And
From
behind all
Ocean
of it is a
Springs,
family
a
still
wide
waiting for the
receiver at
answer
Southwest
no
Mississippi
parent
Community
should ever
College,
have to wait for.
with a season in front
What
of him.
happened to their
a son who filmed everything.
That is the question.
Because he was the kind
Not
of
who can
teenager who
create the
thought
most
there would be
convincing
time to
theory.
look back at it later.
Not who
On
can
the
make the
4th of
most
July,
shocking
he
accusation.
got on a boat with people
Not
he
who can
trusted
turn a
and went
screenshot
to an
into a
island he
headline.
had no reason to
What
fear.
happened?
On the
And
19th
until
of
the
August,
evidence
he would have
answers that
turned
question,
19.
the
His family did
responsible
not hold a
position is to
birthday.
keep
They
investigating.
asked the country to pray.
Keep asking.
And on the 5th of July,
Keep
before
verifying.
any of this existed,
And keep
his mother
separating what
sat
we
with her
know from
phone
what
and
we merely
typed 4
suspect.
words to a boy who
If
had
you
been
want to
there.
follow that investigation
What kind of
with
sunglasses?
us, make sure you
She
like
is
this
still
video.
waiting for an answer
Subscribe
to a much
Brian
larger
Case
question.
Records and
Not a
turn
verdict,
on notifications.
not an arrest, an
because
accounting.
this story is
a
not
complete,
finished.
public,
And in
documented
the next part,
explanation
we
of
are
how
going
her son
deeper
died,
into the evidence
produced by the
surrounding the
people
critical
whose job
hours
it
of
is to
July
produce
4.
it. That is
The
not a
boat,
controversial thing
the
to
distress
ask
call,
for. It is the
the
minimum.
last reported
And
sightings,
until the phone is open,
the phone,
until the grand jury
the
sits,
conflicting
and
accounts,
until somebody with
and the
authority
records
stands
that
in
may
front of a
help determine
microphone
whether
and
the
says what
story
happened
told
on Horn
publicly
Island
from
on
the
the 4th of
beginning
July,
still
the
holds
only
together
thing
when
keeping
every
this case
piece is
alive
placed
is
beside
that
the
people
others.
like you have not looked
Because the
away
question
yet,
is
that
no
the
longer
internet has
simply what
decided
people
your
said.
caution is the crime.
The question is whether the
You
evidence
have seen
agrees.
this case in your feed for
And that
7
is where the
weeks.
real
You have
investigation
probably scrolled
begins.
past 3